Welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. I'm Anne, and this is the 11th video in this star sampler series. Today I'll be showing you two more methods for making these sawtooth stars. Both of these methods are based on this flying geese unit. The first method, you'll learn about quick corners. It's a fast and easy method for figuring out cutting sizes. In the second method, which I refer to as a no-waste sawtooth star, it might be a little more confusing to figure out the cutting sizes, but you won't waste any material. So you might be wondering, why so many different techniques? Well, it's a good idea to explore different methods so you can see which one best fits your skill set. In this sampler quilt, you'll need 5 different sawtooth stars, so you get a chance to try out each one of these methods. Another reason for trying out different methods has to do with your fabric choices. If I wanted to use a directional print in these stars, then I would use templates to cut out the pieces, even though I usually don't like to use templates, but in order to get my fabric just so, that would be the best method to use. If I had lots of 2-inch strips of fabric, I might want to try this sawtooth star with quick corners, because many of these pieces can be cut from 2-inch strips. So the more options you have, often the more proficient you'll be at sewing up your project. So come on in and let's get started. You can download these supply lists at LearnHowToQuilt.com under the Quilt Classes tab. Then click on the Star Sampler class, or click on the links below. You'll need 5 of these star blocks for the Star Sampler quilt. To make each of these stars, you only need a small amount of 2 different fabrics. An 8 by 8 inch piece of fabric will give you more than enough room to cut out all the pieces for your stars. You might decide you want to use more than 2 different fabrics in your star. Just be aware that some directional prints might cause problems. This quick corner method uses only squares and other rectangles, which can be easier to sew than these triangles with bias edges. This technique does waste some fabric, so you might not want to use this if you're making a large number of stars. Figuring out the cutting sizes for this block is pretty easy. Since you're only cutting squares and other rectangles, you just follow the rectangle rule, which is to add 1/2 of an inch to the finished size. So for the center star, it's 3-inch square, so your cutting size will be a 3.5 inch square. For these star points, they're 1.5 inches, and if you add 1/2 of an inch, that makes 2 inches, so you'll cut 2-inch squares for this. For the background fabric, this also is 1.5 inches, so you'll cut 2-inch squares for this. And then for this background, which is 3 inches by 1.5 inches, you'll cut a 3.5 inch by 2-inch rectangle. Before you get started, make sure all your fabric's been pressed, and then cut 1 3.5 inch square for the center, 4 2-inch squares for the background corners, and then 4 2-inch by 3.5 inch rectangles of background fabric, and then cut 8 squares at 2 inches for the star points. To get started, you'll want to take these star points and then mark the diagonal on the wrong side. Make sure that you go from corner to corner. Put right sides together and then stitch along this diagonal line. To speed up your sewing, you can chain piece these. I used red thread so you could see, but you want to use a matching color thread. So I've stitched on that line, and then I take this over to my ironing board and I press that section back. So I get something that looks like this. So you have some extra bulk in here. You can leave all that inside, or I like to trim it out. So I just eyeball about 1/4 inch and clip. Take the second square set the diagonal in this direction, line up the edges, and stitch down that line. After sewing, I press this back, and then I'll clip out this side. Now I'm ready to sew in rows. I put right sides together, and then I'll stitch 1/4 inch seams. After sewing, you want to press each row, and then put right sides together. Make sure to match these intersections, and then stitch. And here's my completed block. At this point, it should be a 6.5 inch square. If you'd like more detailed instructions on sewing this block together, you can check out the previous video in this series. I'll leave the links below. To figure out the cutting sizes using the no waste method, you'll need to remember 2 measurements, 7/8 of an inch and 1 1/4 inches. If these numbers sound familiar to you, you're right. 7/8 of an inch is used to figure out half square triangles cutting sizes, and 1 1/4 inch is what you use to figure out the cutting size for quarter square triangles. So for these star points that are 1.5 inches, you'll want to add 7/8 of an inch to that, and you end up with a cutting size of 2 3/8 inches. So you'll need to cut 4 squares at 2 3/8 inches. For these background triangles, they're 3 inches across here. So you have to go 3 inches plus that 1.25 inches, and you end up with a cutting size of 4 1/4 inches. So you need to cut 1 square 4 1/4 inches. Now I'm using a directional print here, which I don't recommend using, but we're just going to see how it turns out. You'll also need to cut 4 2-inch squares of the background fabric for these 4 corners, and then 1 3.5 inch square of the star fabric for this center. Before sewing, you'll want to draw a diagonal on each one of these 2 3/8 inch squares. Take 2 of these squares and line them up in the corners, making sure that that diagonal runs all the way through both of those squares. You'll get a little overlap here in the middle. Don't worry about that. Pin those squares in place, and then you want to sew a 1/4 inch over from that line on each side. So you can see where I've stitched that 1/4 inch on both sides of that diagonal line. And then I'll cut down that line. And I end up with 2 pieces that look like this. I press both of these units towards the smaller triangles. Then I'll take another one of these squares and line it up in the corner with the diagonal going in this direction. Then pin in place. I stitch a 1/4 inch over from this diagonal line on both sides, and then I cut on the diagonal line. I'll take this over to the ironing board and press. You'll end up with 4 flying geese units. Now, they'll have these little ears, and you can use a rotary cutter or your scissors to trim these off. Lay out your block and then sew each one of these rows, and then sew all 3 rows together. At this point, your star should measure 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. I think this directional fabric was okay to use. I didn't match everything up perfectly, but for me, it's okay. Except I probably should have paid more attention to this piece in the corner. I should have turned it so that it would have matched the direction of these other pieces. Using templates to cut out my pieces would have been a better choice. If you've been following this series, you've seen 4 different ways to cut out and sew this Sawtooth block. Actually, 5 different ways if you count templates. In the next video, you'll get to experiment with these methods when you learn to make a double Sawtooth star. Hope you stay tuned. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please like, subscribe, and share our videos with your friends. Thanks.